Good evening. I am the Maven of the Eventide, and welcome to Vampire Reviews. Yes. Well, I mean, they're not for me. They're for my fledgling spawn, because you gotta start them young. Do you remember your first time? Your first encounter with a vampire as a child? I'm not talking literally, of course, unless you happen to be the luckiest kid in the world. But when did you first become conceptually aware of the wonder and glory of the creatures of the night? Who was it? An individual vampire? A franchise? What took you beyond the generic pop culture understanding of Dracula to a true aficionado of the blood-sucking undead? Nowadays, vampires are everywhere, for all ages, but back when we were kids, unless you were one of those precocious youths who grew up watching mature horror movies or reading Stephen King or Anne Rice, when it came to vampires for children, the pop culture understanding of Dracula was all most kids had, aside from the watered-down vegetarian vampires of cartoons and cereal boxes. The pop culture understanding of Dracula portrays a terrifying assailant who wants to murder you and or turn you into a murderer. So scary! Conversely, vampires for youngsters are usually funny or sweet, not scary. Definitely not bloody and gory, because God forbid we frighten the children. The kids often like to be scared. It's fun, as long as it's not too real, and that's where the fantasy aspect comes in. Children's horror has always been popular, especially in written media. Look at the original brutally dark Grimm's fairy tales. Remember Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark? Those books were the bomb, and the Goosebumps books were a huge phenomenon in the 90s. For preteens everywhere, not just baby goths. But of the 62 books in the original Goosebumps series, only one was about vampires. And though they were creepy and twisted, these books were still relatively sanitized. R.L. Stine even credits their success specifically to his pointed refusal to include depravity or violence in any of the stories. But it was Goosebumps' lack of darkness and depth that directly inspired the author known as Darren Shan to create the especially violent vampire children's series that began with the novel Cirque du Freak, A Living Nightmare. He wrote it back in 1997 after happening to flip through a random Goosebumps book when he was bored one day, and he was like, I could write a better story than this predictable formulaic stuff, except, with a fancy accent because he's Irish. And he channeled his inner Stephen King fan and childhood love/terror relationship with Dracula to develop a saga for 9 to 12-year-olds that was as easy to read as Goosebumps, but didn't shy away from blood and gore and death, or the deep, dark moral and philosophical quandaries that come with vampire metaphors. Previously, he'd only written adult novels under his real name, Darren O'Shaughnessy, and when his agent started pitching this new children's series to publishers in the late 90s, none of them wanted it. He says they hated it. It's too risky, too dark for children, nothing like this has ever been successful before. It was rejected by 20 publishers. After some begging by his agent, one editor decided to give it a second chance, and the author did some revisions, but then that editor left the publishing company, and her replacement shelved the series. Not really because they didn't think it was any good, but because they were afraid they couldn't make any money off of it. Because that's what it comes down to in publishing. Not only were the books darker and scarier than children's media usually is, but Darren Shan's vampires themselves were different. And the publishing world doesn't often like different, doesn't like taking risks. Fortunately for Shan, his agent also represented another author who just so happened to become a little bit popular at the end of the 90s. You may have heard of her. She goes by J.K. Rowling, and it made the publisher think again. Shan says, I imagine the thought going through their minds was, well, if my agent was right about that series for children, maybe he's right about this series too. And so, the Darren Shan saga finally got its chance, with the first book being released in January 2000, followed by 11 more over the next 5 years, along with 4 more in a spin-off series. Yeah, he is an exceedingly prolific author. He's published 50 books so far, and he's not even 50 years old yet, and that's not even counting the dozens of other books he's written that remain unpublished. Not only is he a writing machine, putting out 2 to 5 books a year, and since becoming a #1 best-selling author in the UK, but he's extremely involved with his adoring fan base as well. He does public appearances galore and boasts one of the most engaged author websites I've ever seen. He's highly supportive of encouraging young burgeoning writers and even includes an entire 30-part curriculum of writing tips he's developed on his website. The Cirque du Freak series stars a child of undisclosed age. He reads to be about 10 years old, maybe 12 if we're being generous, who is also named Darren Shan. Young Darren presents his saga as a true story, and the author has often played into this gimmick when meeting his young fans who believe he is actually a vampire who has lived these extraordinary experiences. Darren starts out as a completely normal little boy who ends up in a supernatural situation, and this juxtaposition of the macabre and the mundane is part of what draws in so many readers who are either young enough to believe the gimmick or just like to imagine something so exciting could possibly happen to them one day. We can dream. Obviously, the author isn't actually a vampire writing a true story, but when asked about it in all seriousness, he explains that the growth young Darren experiences in the books is true of himself, and the vampire metaphors are representative of true things in the world. In the first book, young Darren Shan makes a bad choice that leads him to becoming a half-vampire and assistant to the vampire Mr. Crepsley, who is a performer in a traveling freak show called the Cirque du Freak. Torn from his normal life and caught up in the vampire's world, young Darren is set on a dark and frightening path that unfolds over 12 books. They are organized into 4 sets of 3, and tonight we'll focus on the first trilogy, Vampire Blood. Each book tells its own story, but these first 3 chiefly act as the prologue to the larger, overarching story which then begins in book 4, which we will discuss another night. Despite the books being blurbed by J.K. Rowling the first time she'd ever done that for another author, the series wasn't an instant bestseller. It took a while to take off, but it got there eventually. And now, 20 years later, it's fondly remembered by the younger half of the millennial generation and Gen Z as providing their formative vampire experience. Teachers and parents cite it to this day as the series that gets their formerly book-phobic kids, especially boys, into reading. And all for the same reason that initially kept it from being published in the first place. It did vampires differently. Shan describes it himself as a good book for people who don't normally read books, because it gives you something that most books don't. It's unpredictable. He says, when you start out, you don't know how it's going to finish up. Most books usually start out and follow a normal format. This was the exact problem he had with Goosebumps, how formulaic they were. The template for Cirque du Freak, he says, is the movie Psycho. It starts out as one thing. There's a big revelation midway through, and it becomes something else again. He says the books are written for children who really like to be scared. He turns up his nose at things like the Buffy the Vampire Slayer series, which he thought turned a scary theme into light entertainment. Children and adults are always interested in dark things. You can't change that, he says. It's like a roller coaster ride. You can get off a really scary roller coaster ride at the end, and it's the same with a book. Most people like to be scared, but at the same time, they like to be safe. Children love being frightened by books and films, he says. They enjoy the creepy feeling because they know it won't hurt them. Some people ask if I'm not afraid of giving children nightmares, but I just laugh. Horror stories are meant to give you nightmares. That's part of the enjoyment. It's a shot of adrenaline, but it's not just about children in general. It was personal for the author. I loved being scared as a child, loved that creepy feeling. In real life you have worries, but in fantasy you have scares. I really enjoy that. Now, there's an inherent privilege in having a childhood where you feel safe enough to enjoy scares in the first place, and it absolutely isn't for everybody, and that's okay. But another one of the aspects of these books that really resonated with the generation is that unpredictability we mentioned earlier. Right from the prologue, book 1 states, "Real life's nasty. It's cruel. It doesn't care about heroes and happy endings and the way things should be. In real life, bad things happen." The whole underlying premise of the series is tragic. Young Darren has a happy, normal, healthy childhood, and yet it's ripped from him by a vampire who forces him unwillingly into a new, bloody, terrifying existence of danger, where he must live as an outcast to the rest of the world. It's all a direct result of one bad choice Darren makes, but the consequences of this choice are extreme and terrible. He steals the vampire's pet spider. Even though he's never indulged in delinquent behavior before in his life, it's the first really bad thing he's ever done. The venomous spider ends up biting his best friend, and Darren has to give himself to the vampire in exchange for the antidote to save his friend's life. Which is the right choice, a heroic sacrifice, but it only results in suffering for Darren. The vampire turns him into a half-vampire and forces him to become his assistant. But Darren doesn't just become this monstrous creature he'd previously feared. This poor little boy also has to fake his own death and give up his entire life as he knew it, never to see his family again. Unlike most children's stories where a character would learn a lesson from his bad choice and be able to return to a happy or triumphant ending somehow, Darren ends the first book losing everything he's ever loved, traumatizing everyone who's ever loved him, and facing a future that repulses him in servitude to a vampire master he despises. The author explains, "I wanted the readers to really think about what Darren goes through, losing his family and friends because of something he did that was actually good. But he is in a situation that is beyond his control, and that's what makes it so frightening." And the stakes just keep getting higher as the series goes on. Though Darren saves his friend's life in the first book, he fails to save another friend in the second book. This other little boy dies in his arms, partly as a result of more choices Darren made, and Darren has to deal with all the resulting grief and guilt. And besides scratching children's itch for horror and darkness in general, the way the books specifically handle vampires was quite unlike what most kids had previously been exposed to before the turn of the century. We've long had a wide variety of complex vampires in books and media aimed at teenagers, but when it comes to middle school and grade school, the messages and morals are usually kept simple, black and white, good and bad. Bad decisions are punished, good deeds are rewarded. The vampires either completely reject usual vampire stereotypes, or they're evil villains who must be defeated or changed.
If you fail, it means unspeakable torture.
Darren Shan wanted to show a different side of vampires, and so his are somewhere in the middle. They're dark, scary, violent blood drinkers who do a lot of morally objectionable things, and yet they're not evil. They're not killers. That's where he draws the line. "I never understood why vampires had to be evil," he says. "They simply obey their nature. Why should they kill? Why not take just some blood while people are sleeping, unseen and unbothered? It's more sensible not to kill, and also makes life easier for the vampires. No lynch mobs to hunt them down. Why not indeed? Quite practical." And this blew kids' minds. Child Darren learns this himself in book 1. He starts the series believing in the vampire stereotype, that they are all evil. He thinks, what sort of lunatic actually wants to be a vampire? Well, excuse me. But his prejudices are shaken when he meets Mr. Crepsley. "Vampires are not evil monsters of lore," Crepsley tells. "We respect life. We are not killers. Just because we drink blood does not mean we are evil. Are vampire bats evil?" "That's different," Darren says. "They're animals." "Humans are animals too," Crepsley says. If a vampire kills a human, then yes, he is evil. But where is the harm in a little blood to fill his rumbling belly? And Darren has no answer to that. It takes him a long time to adjust to it, though. After all, becoming a half vampire isn't easy, especially for someone like him who was happy in his normal life. But his normal life is gone. It was there one day and the next, tragedy. And in this way, the vampire here serves as a metaphor for growing up. The true, gritty reality of growing up. Learning that bad things happen, unfair things, good deeds aren't always rewarded, choices can have unfairly extreme consequences, and there's no going back. Letting go of the childish ideals that things happen for a reason or with a purpose, learning that it's instead how you respond to what does happen, and make the most of who you're growing to be. After all, new scary situations can be exciting. There are times when Darren doesn't completely hate his new vampire life of adventure. The second book, The Vampire's Assistant, portrays Darren's arc of coming to terms with his new vampire nature, his loss of innocence, and growing maturity. He spends the whole book resisting his natural urge to drink blood from a human. Despite all Mr. Crepsley's taught him about how not evil vampires really are, Darren's afraid doing it means he will become evil. But if he doesn't do it, he'll die. But he's kind of okay with that. He naively thinks it makes him noble and heroic. He'd rather die than lose what he thinks will be the last of his humanity. Even though he doesn't have to kill the humans and the person will feel no pain and never even know some of their blood was taken, he's still 100% against doing it because he's still hung up on his youthful misconceptions of evil. He doesn't want to let go of that last bit of childhood's sense of justice. But because he resists drinking blood, he becomes sickly. And then he's too weak to save his friend Sam from an exceedingly gory and gruesome death. If Darren had just drank blood from a human like Mr. Crepsley told him to do, Sam might have lived. Another traumatic lesson for Darren to learn. As Sam lies in Darren's arms, disemboweled and bleeding to death, Mr. Crepsley pushes Darren to drink Sam's blood because if Sam dies that way, a little bit of his soul will live on within Darren in a way to keep him with him. Darren does it, and finally crosses the line into being a true blood-drinking creature of the night. But to his amazement, he's still not evil. He's still himself. He's losing his naivete and childhood innocence, but not his humanity, because those are not the same thing. This vampire metaphor representative of children's development is pretty dark, but growing up can be dark. Publishers feared these books were too serious for kids, but that impulse to protect and shelter children's innocence can be detrimental to their development. Kids don't need to be coddled with safe media, with vegetarian vampires. Letting them explore darker themes in a safe environment like a book is healthy. And these books resonate with kids. Their army of fans is proof of that. Just like with Darren drinking blood, the darkness of these books develops their humanity, not strips it. They learn that part of growing up is making hard choices that often don't have a perfect answer. Life just happens that way sometimes, and you have to do the best you can. The third book, Tunnels of Blood, delves deeper into vampire lore and young Darren's understanding of the complexities of good and evil. He's still prejudiced against vampires, and when Mr. Crepsley starts acting mysterious and then the news reports bodies found drained of blood, Darren jumps to the assumption that Mr. Crepsley is an evil murderer after all. He's wrong, of course, and themes of loyalty and trust and pride are explored. Mr. Crepsley learns that he must respect Darren's maturity more and be more forthcoming with him about his vampire secrets. And Darren is further disillusioned about the black and white nature of morality. This is also the book where he learns that another type of vampire exists called the Vampanese. The Vampanese kill their victims, and all vampires used to be this way until they decided as a group to outlaw murdering. A few didn't like the new rules and broke off to form their own faction, keeping to the old ways, naming themselves vampanese. But despite that line between good and evil Mr. Crespley draws in the first book, in this book, he explains that the lines are murkier. The fact that the vampanese are killers does not necessarily make them evil. They kill their victims because they respect life a different way. To them, killing people is more honorable. They believe there is nobility in draining a person and absorbing their spirit, and that there is shame in taking small amounts, feeding like a leech. As a society, vampanese are supposedly now peaceful amongst themselves and follow rules, only killing when needed. But sometimes the blood drives them mad, and then they go rogue, killing mercilessly outside of the rules. It's these rogue vampanese that provide the evil vampire reputation and stereotypes most of the world believes. One of these rogue vampanese, Merlot, is responsible for the bodies in Book 3. And because Darren jumps to the conclusion that Mr. Crespley is the killer, he spoils the vampire's chance at stopping Merlot. This results in another one of Darren's friends being victimized. They are able to rescue him before he dies this time, but Darren learns a lesson about the gray areas of morality. Because he was naively and pompously assuming he was more moral than everyone else, Mr. Crespley especially, he puts his friend's life in danger. Also, in this book, Darren gets his first girlfriend, but he has to give her up at the end because of the nature of his vampire existence. It puts her as a human in danger. This is another hard choice he has to make, an unfair consequence of the tragic turn his life has taken. He can never be close to normal people again because of what he is. It's isolating to be in this situation, but it's something many real kids reading about him can identify with if they have trouble connecting to their peers due to difficult life situations, whether it be family troubles, obligations, responsibilities, or any other situation that makes them feel outcast from who they perceive as normal people. The unfair responsibilities thrust upon Darren at such a young age are relatable for many children out there. And this is all just the prologue. The real story starts in Book 4. Yes, I know what you're all wanting to ask me right now. What about the movie? Do we have to? In 2009, they made a loosely mashed up film out of these first 3 books called The Vampire's Assistant. It aged Darren up to 16 to try to ride on Twilight's coattails and the teenage vampire mania of the time. But instead of making the story's themes deeper or more nuanced with this more mature protagonist, it simplified them greatly. Now the message is about, like, prejudice and bigotry against freaks is wrong.
We don't want you filthy people here.
Freak!
And
being human's not about what you are. It's about who you are.
Just because I'm a vampire doesn't mean I'm bloodthirsty. It's not about what you are, it's about who you are.
it's obvious whoever made these decisions for the film had absolutely no understanding of why the books resonate with children, and it did atrociously at the box office. John C. Reilly is horribly miscast as the cantankerous and sinister Mr. Crespley, and also it whitewashed Darren's black girlfriend and replaced her with this monkey girl.
I'm a monkey girl.
Which... this is where I get off. I'm the Maven of the Eventide, and we will discuss the next 3 books in the Darren Shan saga another night. But until then, start 'em young. Good night. Don't you hate it when your hair keeps getting stuck in your spider? Thank you for watching my video, and thank you to all my Patreon patrons for making this video possible. If you would like to help me make more vampire reviews, to talk about more books and all of your favorite childhood vampire nostalgia, please consider supporting me on Patreon. $2 a video gets you exclusive first access to all my videos before they go public. $10 a video gets your name in the credits like you just saw. That could be you, your name on this video. If you can't support me, then just like this video, leave me a comment to appease the algorithm lords, subscribe to my channel, and I will see you next time. Good night.